I never thought a single knock at the door could unravel everything I thought I knew about myself. That morning, the rain had been relentless, hammering against the windows as if the sky itself wanted to warn me. And yet, there she was, smiling, calm, deliberate, like she had known all along I'd be sitting there, frozen in my own indecision. Her eyes held a kind of quiet authority that made my chest tighten, and before I knew it, my voice had deserted me. You're here?" I stammered, though I barely understood why her presence made me feel like I'd been caught in a trap I hadn't even seen coming. Her voice was soft, deliberate, yet impossible to ignore. "I know," she said, stepping inside. "And you're going to let me help you." That phrase echoed in my head, though I had no idea what she meant. Help me or change me? The line felt impossibly thin. I wanted to ask, to protest, but something in the way she moved, the subtle grace in her gestures, made every word stick in my throat. It wasn't fear exactly. It was fascination, tinged with a strange, unnameable excitement. She had a way of looking at me that seemed to strip away the defenses I had spent years building. Every thought I had about who I was seemed to wobble under her gaze, fragile, uncertain. By the time she placed a small, folded envelope on the table, my hands were trembling. "Open it," she instructed. My fingers hesitated, caught between curiosity and a strange dread, but the pull of her presence was magnetic. Inside, a single note: "You will see yourself differently by tomorrow." I laughed nervously, attempting to shake off the strange tension curling in my stomach, but the laughter felt hollow, echoing oddly in the small, dimly lit room. The envelope contained more than words. There were tiny objects, carefully arranged, soft fabrics, delicate brushes, and a mirror so small it seemed fragile enough to shatter in my hands. And in that moment, the first thread of a new identity began to weave itself around me. I didn't know it yet, but the rules of who I thought I was were already beginning to bend. Something inside me was waking, a curious, trembling part of me that had been whispering quietly for years. The day stretched long, filled with strange instructions that I couldn't fully comprehend. She guided me gently, correcting the way I held myself, the way I moved. At first, it was awkward, unnatural, humiliating even. But slowly, beneath the awkwardness, there was a shimmer of recognition. I caught glimpses in the mirror, a softer expression, a hesitant curve in my posture, an unfamiliar warmth in my eyes. By the time the sky darkened, I barely recognized myself. My reflection no longer felt like a stranger's. It was someone emerging, someone fragile yet compelling. And I realized, with both fear and exhilaration, that I had been caught in her plan and I had no desire to escape. The night settled around the house like a heavy blanket, and I couldn't sleep. Every corner of my mind was spinning with the day's events, each memory twisting in on itself. I kept replaying her eyes, the calm authority in the way she moved, the way she had gently but insistently guided me through actions I didn't even understand at the time. There had been no coercion, no threats, yet I had obeyed every instruction, feeling a curious relief in letting someone else take control. And yet, I couldn't shake the strange tension, a mix of fear, fascination, and something I couldn't name, a longing, maybe, or an unspoken acknowledgement that the person I thought I was had always been just one layer of who I could become. The morning came slowly, the rain giving way to a timid sunlight that barely touched the windows. She appeared again, almost as if she had been waiting, and I realized I hadn't even noticed how long I had been staring at the mirror the night before. I barely recognized the person staring back, softer features, an unfamiliar curve to my jaw, and eyes that seemed to flicker with both uncertainty and intrigue. I blinked and tried to dismiss it as imagination, yet the reflection held a subtle truth that was impossible to ignore. "Today, we begin properly," she said, her voice calm but commanding, like a melody that refused to leave your mind. I nodded, almost mechanically, my heart pounding in anticipation and unease. She handed me a robe, silken, soft, almost fragile, and the first time I slipped into it, the sensation was electric. The fabric clung to me in ways that made me acutely aware of my own body, of shapes I had never allowed myself to notice before. It was both unnerving and intoxicating, and I realized I had never felt this kind of attention to myself, this deliberate, careful noticing. She guided me through small rituals that seemed absurd at first, touching my hair in certain ways, moving my hands, tilting my head, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, the mirror reflected a different person. A person who moved with tentative grace, whose posture and gestures no longer screamed awkwardness, but whispered possibility. I was mesmerized and terrified all at once. Every instruction she gave felt like peeling back layers I hadn't realized I was hiding behind. My reflection began to respond to me differently, softer, more alert, as though it had been waiting for recognition. As the day stretched on, she brought in more items, carefully chosen outfits, ribbons, and small accessories that seemed absurdly delicate for someone like me. I couldn't understand why I was drawn to them, yet I felt a thrill every time she suggested I try something new. Each piece felt like a puzzle, and every adjustment she made felt like a revelation. The first time she tied a scarf around my neck, the world seemed to pause. The fabric smelled faintly of her perfume, subtle and grounding, and I realized I was breathing differently, lighter, almost floating. We moved slowly through the afternoon, the house quiet except for the occasional rustle of fabric or the soft tap of her heels on the floor. I spoke little, because words felt inadequate. Every thought seemed to fracture into multiple layers: confusion, curiosity, desire, fear, and a strange, growing exhilaration. I found myself examining my own expressions in the mirror, noting the subtle changes, the small shifts in the curve of my smile, the way my eyes lingered on my own reflection. By evening, she guided me to a full-length mirror, one I hadn't noticed before. "Look," she said softly, "see who you are becoming." I hesitated, dread and anticipation warring in my chest, then stepped closer. My reflection was no longer the boy who had nervously answered her knock that first morning. My shoulders had softened, my stance held a fragile elegance, and my face, though still undeniably me, was transformed in ways I couldn't yet name. I blinked, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of recognition. Not just at my appearance, but at something deeper, something long buried. A part of me that had always wanted to emerge, hidden beneath layers of habit, fear, and conformity. She smiled, faint and knowing. "You've been waiting for this, haven't you?" I swallowed hard. The answer was undeniable, even to me. Yes. I had been waiting, and yet, the waiting had been shadowed by uncertainty, by shame, by the unspoken rules I had told myself I needed to follow. But now there was possibility. As the evening drew on, she led me through a small ceremony of sorts, subtle, almost imperceptible adjustments, and then a final gesture. She placed a delicate ribbon in my hair, a mark of transformation, not just in appearance, but in mindset. My hands trembled as I touched it, and I realized that the fear that had gripped me earlier had softened into something else. Anticipation. Hope, perhaps. And then, just as the last light of day faded into night, she left me alone with my reflection. I touched my face, traced the line of my jaw, the curve of my lips, the delicate sweep of my hair, and for the first time, I didn't feel confusion or resistance. I felt potential. A fragile, trembling potential that whispered, "This is who you can be." Sleep didn't come easily, but when it did, it was filled with dreams of who I might become, dreams that seemed more real than waking life had ever felt. I woke the next morning with the first stirrings of a realization that I couldn't deny. I had been caught in her perfect plan, and the plan had worked. I was not the same person I had been. I was someone else, someone fragile, someone luminous, someone awakening. The next morning felt surreal, as though the world had subtly shifted while I slept. I woke to sunlight filtering through the curtains, soft and golden, brushing across my face in a way that felt intimate, almost accusatory. The reflection in the mirror was no longer a mere experiment. It was my new reality staring back, and I found myself studying it with both awe and apprehension. Every small detail, the softness of my jawline, The delicate slope of my shoulders, the curve of my hands, seemed alive, waiting for recognition, and for the first time, I realized I couldn't go back. Not fully. She arrived soon after, her presence immediately filling the room, commanding without demand. "It's time to see how the world will respond to you," she said, a faint, almost mischievous smile playing on her lips. My stomach dropped. Social interaction? The thought had never been frightening in the abstract, but now, stepping out as this new version of myself, I felt exposed in a way I couldn't articulate. Every instinct screamed caution, yet something deeper, curiosity, perhaps even trust, urged me to follow. We walked slowly through the streets, her hand occasionally brushing mine, not in intimacy, but in guidance. I could feel every head turn, every curious glance, and my chest tightened with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. For the first time, I realized that transformation was not just skin deep. It was in the way I moved, the way I held myself, the subtle confidence or fragility that radiated outward. Each step was a negotiation between who I had been and who I was becoming. She guided me into a small cafe, and as I approached the counter, I felt the weight of every eye on me. The barista smiled politely, yet there was a subtle shift in tone, a recognition of difference that made me acutely aware of my own presence. I fumbled slightly, my voice softer than I expected, higher, almost unfamiliar to my own ears.
She didn't correct me.
She simply smiled, a silent affirmation that this new voice, this new self, was entirely acceptable. And slowly I began to accept it too. Throughout the day, small challenges emerged, an awkward conversation with a stranger, a hesitant glance from someone on the street, the quiet judgment I imagined in every gaze. Each encounter was a test, and each one revealed a new layer of me. Some moments brought embarrassment, others exhilaration, and occasionally, a surge of something I hadn't anticipated. Pride. Not loud, brash pride, but the quiet, internal recognition that I was navigating a world differently, that I could exist in this form and be seen, noticed, and still be myself. By evening, exhaustion settled into my bones, but the emotional intensity lingered. Alone in my room, I traced my fingers along the contours of my reflection, marveling at the small triumphs of the day, the way I had held my head high despite fear, the way my movements had begun to flow more naturally. And yet there was tension too. I realized that this transformation, this emergence of a self I had barely dared to imagine, was fragile. One careless glance, one misplaced word, could unravel it, and the thought both terrified and thrilled me. She appeared quietly, without announcement, as if reading my thoughts. "You're doing well," she said softly. Her gaze held a depth that made me feel simultaneously exposed and protected. "But tomorrow will be harder." My heart clenched. Harder? I wanted to ask why, to protest, but the words caught in my throat. I knew, without needing to hear, that the next stage of her plan would push me further into the unknown, testing the boundaries of who I was willing to become, of how far I could trust both myself and her guidance. And as I lay down that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized that transformation wasn't just about appearances. It was about identity, about the delicate, fragile threads of self-perception being rewoven under her meticulous hand. And I, willingly or not, had surrendered to it. The plan had caught me completely, and I was already falling deeper into its intricate, inescapable weave. The morning air carried a chill that seemed to mirror the nervous flutter in my chest. Today, she said, we would meet others, people who would see me as I now was. My hands shook slightly as I dressed, the delicate fabrics she had carefully chosen feeling impossibly significant. Each ribbon, each fold of silk, was no longer just an accessory. It was armor, a statement, a declaration of the person I was becoming. When she arrived, she was all calm assurance, the very presence of her a tether keeping me grounded. "You are ready," she said simply, but the weight behind her words pressed down on me. Ready. Ready to be seen. Ready to exist. I swallowed hard, trying to reconcile the fragile new identity that had taken shape in the mirror with the unpredictability of the world outside. The first steps into the city felt surreal. I was acutely aware of every detail, the way my shoes clicked against the pavement, the subtle sway of my posture, the way passers-by glanced, curious, polite, sometimes confused. Each look sent a pulse through me, fear, thrill, and a strange exhilaration intertwined. I realized that my reflection had become more than just an image. It had become a lens through which the world would now interpret me. We entered a small cafe, and I felt my chest tighten. This time, she had arranged for friends, people who were aware, even eager, to meet me in this new form. My mind raced. What if I faltered? What if they saw through me, judged me? But as I stepped forward, she gently guided my hands, adjusted a loose curl, and whispered, "You are enough." That single phrase grounded me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The conversations were gentle at first, strangers offering smiles and light questions. I stumbled over words occasionally, my voice still unfamiliar, but I noticed the warmth in their reactions, the acceptance, the curiosity, not disdain. And with each small success, I felt my confidence grow, fragile yet tangible. There was a thrill in being seen, in realizing that my presence could exist authentically without apology. Yet, even as the day unfolded, doubt crept in at the edges of my mind. Every glance felt scrutinizing. Every smile could mask judgment. I caught myself comparing my reactions, my gestures, to theirs, wondering if I moved too hesitantly, spoke too softly, carried myself too cautiously. She noticed, of course, and would gently correct me, sometimes with a touch, sometimes with a quiet word. Her guidance was subtle, yet relentless, like water slowly reshaping stone. By afternoon, fatigue set in, but the emotional intensity was nothing compared to the internal storm raging inside me. Alone for a brief moment, I stared into my reflection in the cafe window. The person looking back was undeniably me, yet undeniably not me. The contours of my face softened, my posture more deliberate, every movement tinged with a grace I hadn't known before. I realized with both awe and fear that this new self wasn't just a costume. It was who I could be, who I was becoming. She returned, sensing my hesitation, and placed her hand lightly on my shoulder. "The world will challenge you," she said, eyes steady, "but you will rise. Not because of me, but because you are learning to trust yourself." I nodded, but the truth was, trust still felt like a fragile bridge over a vast chasm. And yet, for the first time, I wanted to step onto it. Evening fell with a quiet intensity. Back in the room where the transformation had begun, I caught sight of myself in the full-length mirror again. The reflection was no longer a stranger. It was a companion, tentative but present. I traced my fingers along my hair, along the soft curve of my shoulders, and felt a deep, strange resonance. This was who I could be. This was me, emerging not as a copy or imitation, but as something wholly new, wholly authentic. She watched silently, and I realized that the plan wasn't about forcing change. It was about uncovering it. Every instruction, every small adjustment, every push beyond comfort had been designed to bring me closer to myself. And though fear still whispered at the edges of my mind, excitement, curiosity, and the raw thrill of discovery had taken root. As night deepened, I lay in bed, tracing the outline of my reflection in my mind, feeling the soft tremor of anticipation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of courage, patience, and self-recognition. And yet a small, stubborn part of me already knew the truth. I had been caught in her perfect plan, and I wasn't fighting it anymore. I wanted to see just how far this transformation could go. The morning light spilled through the curtains like a whisper, and I woke with a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. Today was different. I could feel it in the weight of her gaze when she entered, in the slight curve of her smile that hinted at mischief or perhaps challenge. "Today," she said softly, "you will step further than you have ever gone." Her words were deliberate, loaded with a gravity that made my chest tighten. I nodded, even though a part of me wanted to retreat, to hide in the familiarity of the room and the small mirror that had become a silent confidant. We began the day slowly, meticulously. She guided me through careful movements, gestures refined to subtle perfection. Every tilt of my head, every curl of my fingers, every slight adjustment in posture felt deliberate, choreographed, and yet astonishingly natural. I could feel the mirror in the corner of the room observing me like a patient audience, reflecting the gradual emergence of a self that was at once fragile, defiant, and undeniably real. She introduced new elements, delicate fabrics, ribbons, and accessories that transformed ordinary movements into something fluid, expressive, almost performative. At first, the adjustments felt cumbersome, alien, like trying to move inside a suit that wasn't mine. But gradually, as I followed her guidance, my reflection began to shimmer with a strange vitality. The boy I had once been, the hesitant, awkward figure who had trembled at the first knock on the door, was fading, replaced by someone lighter, more aware, more present in every movement. By late morning, she led me outside, into the bustling streets. The air carried a crispness that made my pulse race. Every step was amplified in my awareness. The way my shoes hit the pavement, the gentle sway of my hips, the subtle curve of my hands as they brushed the air. People glanced at me, sometimes out of curiosity, sometimes recognition, and each look sent a tremor through me. I felt exposed and exhilarated in equal measure. The vulnerability was tangible, almost electric. We entered a cafe she had chosen, small and intimate. She guided me to a table, and I realized that today was about interaction, real social engagement, beyond the mirrors and fabrics. I spoke, cautiously at first, my voice slightly higher, lighter than I had anticipated. Words stumbled, faltered, but she was beside me, a steady presence, never correcting, only guiding. And slowly, the tremor in my speech diminished. Each laugh, each nod, each tentative smile felt like a victory, a small affirmation of this new self I was learning to inhabit. Yet beneath the surface, doubts still lingered. Every glance, every subtle expression from strangers felt loaded with judgment, real or imagined. I caught myself scrutinizing my own movements in reflection, comparing them to her, to the world, to some invisible standard I could not name. And then a moment of raw realization struck me. Transformation wasn't just about appearance. It was about identity, about negotiating who I was internally with who I was becoming externally. And that negotiation was messy, exhausting, terrifying, yet strangely intoxicating. By afternoon, the social experiment had deepened. She arranged for me to meet others who were aware of my journey, friends, colleagues, casual acquaintances, all observing, all curious. My heart hammered with anticipation. Each conversation was a test. Each gesture, each word, felt like a negotiation between my old self and this emerging version. I stumbled at times, faltered, yet with every small success, I felt a quiet, insistent affirmation building within me. I was real. I was visible. I was becoming. The tension peaked when someone I hadn't expected to see appeared, an old acquaintance, a reminder of my past self. Their eyes widened slightly, an almost imperceptible flicker of recognition, and my chest tightened. My voice caught, my hands trembled, and I realized how far this transformation had taken me from the familiar, from the comfort of invisibility. But then she stepped beside me, grounding me with her quiet strength. "You are who you are," she said softly, "and they will see it, whether they understand it or not." Her words anchored me, yet the fear didn't fully dissipate. We spent the rest of the day navigating social spaces, each interaction a delicate dance. By evening, exhaustion settled in, but the emotional intensity remained. Alone in my room, I caught sight of myself in the mirror once more. The reflection was no longer a stranger. It was a companion, luminous, tentative, and undeniable. I traced my fingers along my hair, along the curve of my jaw, and felt a shiver of recognition. This was me, emerging fully, yet still fragile, still vulnerable. She watched silently from the doorway, and I realized the truth. Her plan wasn't about forcing change. It was about revealing it. Every gesture, every adjustment, every step outside my comfort zone had been designed to uncover a self I had long buried beneath hesitation, fear, and doubt. And though exhaustion weighed on me, I felt a fierce, trembling exhilaration. The journey was far from over, but I had crossed a threshold I could never undo. I had been caught, completely, in her perfect plan, and I no longer wished to escape. That night, as I lay in bed, I traced the outline of my reflection in my mind, feeling the pulse of transformation in my bones. The world beyond the window seemed both distant and imminent, a space where this emerging self could be tested, challenged, celebrated. And for the first time, I welcomed it. Fear lingered, yes, but it was accompanied by a stubborn, radiant curiosity. I wanted to see how far this path could take me, how fully I could inhabit this identity. The plan had caught me, yes, but it had also freed me, and I was ready, tentative, trembling, but utterly ready, to step further into the person I was becoming. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, gentle but insistent, as if urging me awake. I rose, still cautious, still fragile, yet beneath the surface, a new pulse of anticipation had begun to stir. Today would be different. I could feel it in the subtle curve of her smile when she arrived, in the quiet determination in her eyes. Today, she said, we reveal more than appearances. The words sent a shiver through me, not of fear, but of electric expectation. The day began with rituals I had grown familiar with, yet each movement now carried a weight, a meaning I hadn't felt before. She guided me through subtle gestures, delicate adjustments, and I felt the reflection in the mirror respond in ways almost magical. Every tilt of my head, every curve of my fingers, every sway of my posture became a language I was learning to speak fluently, not with words, but with presence. I realized that the transformation wasn't just outward, it was internal, woven into the way I breathed, thought, and felt. By mid-morning, she led me outdoors, into the city streets I had begun to navigate with increasing awareness. But today, the streets felt different. The world was not just a backdrop, it was a canvas, and I was learning to paint myself into it with each gesture, each glance. People looked, naturally, curiously, even admiringly at times, and for the first time, I didn't shrink from their gaze. Instead, I met eyes with a tentative confidence, letting the new self I had cultivated respond in its own way. We entered a boutique, small and intimate, filled with fabrics, ribbons, and accessories that seemed chosen to challenge and delight simultaneously. She encouraged me to select pieces, to experiment, to let intuition guide me. My hands trembled as I touched the soft silks and delicate lace, each choice feeling like an extension of who I had become. When I adjusted the scarves and ribbons around my hair and neck, the mirror reflected someone entirely real, someone luminous and alive, someone who could inhabit the world with a presence that was both delicate and undeniable. By afternoon, the intensity deepened. She arranged for me to meet new people, strangers who were intrigued, friends who were curious, observers who tested my composure. Every interaction was a subtle negotiation between fear and exhilaration, between the old self and the emerging self. I stumbled at times, hesitated, faltered, but with each recovery, each quiet triumph, I felt a surge of affirmation that no mirror alone could provide. My voice felt steadier, my movements more fluid, my presence more assured. And yet, beneath it all, a fragile vulnerability lingered, a reminder of the journey still unfolding. One encounter struck me deeply. A young woman approached, her gaze kind and discerning. She spoke gently, complimenting the careful grace I had cultivated, and for a moment, I felt seen, not just as a reflection in a mirror, but as a whole, evolving self. Her words echoed in my mind long after she left, leaving me with a profound awareness. The transformation was not about pleasing others, not about imitation, but about recognition. Recognition of the self I had long ignored, of the identity I had hesitated to embrace. Evening arrived with a quiet intensity. Alone in the room that had become both sanctuary and stage, I stood before the full-length mirror. The reflection was no longer tentative or fractured. It was confident, expressive, fully inhabiting space in a way that thrilled and terrified me simultaneously. I traced my fingers along the curve of my jaw, the line of my collarbone, the sweep of my hair, and felt a strange, luminous resonance. This was me, fragile, luminous, imperfect, yet utterly authentic. She appeared in the doorway, silent, observing, and I realized the truth I had been edging toward. Her plan had never been about forcing change. It had been about creating space to explore, to reveal, to inhabit a self I had only glimpsed in fleeting moments of longing. Every instruction, every subtle push, every challenge had been designed to bring me closer to this realization, to help me embrace what had always been possible but never permitted. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt the pulse of transformation in every fiber of my being. I no longer feared the reflection in the mirror. I no longer doubted my voice, my presence, my right to exist fully in this form. The path ahead was still uncertain, filled with social tests, personal challenges, and moments of vulnerability. But I had crossed thresholds I could never return from. I had been caught in her perfect plan, yes, but in that capture, I had found freedom. And for the first time, I wanted it. Every fear, every hesitation, every trembling doubt had been tempered by the radiant possibility of self-expression, authenticity, and emergence. I had been transformed in ways both subtle and profound, and the journey, I knew, was only beginning. The reflection in the mirror no longer demanded recognition. It offered it willingly, a companion, a guide, a self I could finally call my own. Morning arrived with a quiet intensity, the soft golden light brushing the room as if illuminating not just the space, but the new self I had become. I woke with a strange clarity, a sense of anticipation that pulsed through me like electricity. Today, I realized there would be no more hiding, no more testing, no more hesitancy. I was stepping fully into the person I had been quietly becoming, and every fiber of my being resonated with the weight and thrill of that truth. She entered as always, calm, deliberate, her presence steadying the fluttering storm inside me. "Today," she said softly, her gaze unwavering, "you meet the world fully. Not as an experiment, not as a shadow of your old self, but as who you truly are." My pulse quickened. The words felt both frightening and exhilarating. This was the moment I had been moving toward, consciously or not, from the very first knock on the door, from the first moment I glimpsed the possibilities in the mirror. We moved slowly at first, performing the familiar rituals of adjustment and refinement. Each gesture, each movement, now carried purpose. I had learned to inhabit my body, to wield the subtleties of posture and expression, and with each small act, the reflection in the mirror grew more and more like a companion, an ally rather than a stranger. I could feel her presence behind me, a quiet anchor, yet I also felt a strange independence, a readiness to navigate the world without trembling or hesitation. By mid-morning, she guided me outdoors into the streets I had come to navigate with growing awareness. Today, the city felt alive in a new way. I noticed not just how people looked at me, but how I moved through space, confident, deliberate, attuned to both self and environment. Each step carried authority, not loud or arrogant, but grounded and poised, the result of weeks of careful cultivation and unearthing of my own latent presence. I caught glimpses of my reflection in windows and shop glass, and instead of fear or doubt, I felt recognition. Pure, quiet recognition. We arrived at a small gathering she had organized. Familiar faces, new faces, and strangers who would observe without judgment. I felt a twinge of nervousness, but also a fierce readiness. I could speak fully, move naturally, respond with authenticity rather than self-consciousness. And as the day unfolded, I realized that the last vestiges of hesitation had faded. I laughed freely, moved with ease, and even when eyes lingered, I no longer shrank. I was present, radiant, undeniably myself. A quiet triumph came unexpectedly. One of the strangers approached, noting the care with which I had cultivated my posture, the subtle grace in my gestures, the light in my expression that radiated both confidence and delicacy. Their words were simple, sincere, yet they struck something deep inside me. You are visible, and your presence is real. I realized in that moment that the transformation was complete, not because of fabric or ribbons or careful instruction, but because I had come to inhabit my own being fully, without apology, without doubt. Evening fell, soft and amber, and we returned to the room where it had all begun. I approached the full-length mirror, and this time, there was no hesitation. The person reflected back was me, not a mask, not an experiment, not a fleeting reflection of possibility. It was the culmination of weeks of emotional and psychological exploration, of daring to trust someone else, and ultimately, daring to trust myself. I ran my fingers along my hair, the line of my jaw, the subtle curve of my shoulders, and felt a warmth and completeness that I had never known. She stood quietly in the doorway, observing, and I realized the truth I had been moving toward all along. Her plan had never been about control or coercion. It had been about revelation, about creating space for discovery, for acceptance, for emergence. And I had been ready to be seen, ready to accept, ready to claim this self that had always existed beneath hesitation, beneath fear, beneath layers of doubt. I sat by the window as night fell, watching the city lights flicker and pulse like distant stars. I felt the gentle resonance of my own heartbeat, the steady confidence of a body and mind aligned, and I realized with awe and relief that the transformation was not a moment, but a process, and that I had crossed the threshold fully. The world beyond the glass would see me, yes, but more importantly, I saw myself. And I was whole. For the first time in years, I felt an unbroken sense of peace and anticipation. Fear still lingered at the edges, it always would, but it was tempered by an unshakable clarity. I had been caught in her perfect plan, and in that capture, I had been freed. I had discovered a self I hadn't dared to dream of, nurtured it, tested it, and ultimately embraced it. The mirror no longer reflected only my image, it reflected my truth, my presence, my emergence. And as I finally closed my eyes that night, I smiled softly, a quiet, radiant affirmation. This was me, fully, unapologetically, luminously. The journey had been intricate, challenging, even frightening, but it had been mine, and I had stepped through it completely into the life, the self, and the presence I had always been waiting to claim.